Good evening, I'm Sam Cedar in for Keith Olbermann. This is Monday, December 6th, 701 days until the 2012 presidential election. Tonight, a countdown special report. How much money will the U.S. have to borrow from other countries to finance extending the Bush tax cuts? And why won't the Treasury Department reveal how much they will borrow from Middle Eastern countries? But first, in our fifth story tonight, the reason for borrowing these countries, the president tonight announcing a deal, all but sealed, to extend all the Bush tax cuts for 2 years, postponing the debate until the 2012 presidential campaign. President Obama tonight, after meeting with congressional Democratic leaders, announcing bipartisan agreement on a framework for a deal. In which
the Republicans have asked for more generous treatment of the estate tax than I think is wise or warranted. But we have insisted that that will be temporary. Now, I have no doubt that everyone will find something in this compromise that they don't like. In fact, there are things in here that I don't like, namely the extension of the tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans and the wealthiest estates. But these tax cuts will expire in 2 years, and I'm confident that as we make tough choices about bringing our deficit down, as I engage in a conversation with the American people about the hard choices we're going to have to make to secure our future and our children's future and our grandchildren's future, it will become apparent that we cannot afford to extend those tax cuts any longer.
In return, Republicans would sign off on extending unemployment insurance by another 13 months and a 2% decrease in the payroll tax for another year, as well as some other Obama tax cuts aimed at stimulating job creation. Total cost, at least $450 billion in lost revenue. And just to review, the Democratic plan that Republicans voted down would have renewed tax cuts for everyone in the country. Under both parties' plans, Americans making between $50,000 and $75,000 would get cuts of about $1,100. Under the Democratic plan, those making more than $1 million in 1 year would get a tax cut of $6,300. The Republican plan, which costs another $700 billion over 10 years, give those making more than $1 million a year a tax cut of $104,000 every year. The Senate's number 2 Democrat, Dick Durbin, said yesterday that Congress is moving in the direction of extending all of those tax cuts, quote, and we're only moving there against my judgment. Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell said yesterday that negotiations were still underway, not about whether to extend unemployment insurance, quote, but whether to pay for it, as opposed to adding it to the deficit. Overlooked in the debate so far is how to pay for the tax cuts, which will cost the U.S. an estimated $4 trillion just over the next 10 years, plus interest. Earlier today, Mr. Obama said that raising our deficit will make America less competitive.
I'm looking at the books back in Washington, and folks weren't doing a real good job with their math for the last decade. So now that the threat of a depression has passed and a recovery is beginning to take hold, reducing our long-term deficit has to be a priority. And in the long run, we won't be able to compete with countries like China if we keep borrowing from countries like China.
Already, about half of America's debt is bought by China and other countries. In a Countdown special report tonight, we calculated how much extending the Bush tax cuts will increase that debt to China and to other countries. It's an issue that both parties claim they care about.
Nothing's more important than us no longer borrowing $700 billion or more from China.
One of the major reasons why we're in the difficulties we're in today is because spending got out of control. We owe China $500 billion.
In a Democratic poll this spring, more voters named U.S. debt to China as a top concern than any other issue. A nonpartisan group ran a campaign ad imagining the future of our debt to China.
当然，我们是他们的大债主。现在他们都得给我们干活。
You can change the future. You have to. Join Citizens Against Government Waste to stop the spending that is bankrupting America.
A Tea Party ad with Victoria Jackson imagined a past in which our founding fathers reacted to our debt to China.
Congress said the only way out of debt is to get more into debt. And then we borrow money from China.
China!
So, why does U.S. debt to China matter?
Hard-working people come and say, Senator, they're closing this factory down and shipping our jobs overseas. Why can't we get tough on China? And I say because of the debt that this government under this president has exploded, we are now dependent upon China. And how do you get tough on your banker?
Oh, we're no longer putting China at the top of our list anymore for spying. Really? Now, why wouldn't we do that? Why isn't China at the top of our list?
They should be. They've earned it.
They sure
They're always
earned it.
hacking into our computers.
Right. Same reason why during the Bush administration, when we were running these deficits and I was talking about Bush, stop with the deficits. Why aren't we complaining about poison toys that they're sending over?
Of course.
Right. Because we need their money.
The co-chairs of the president's bipartisan panel on debt reduction wrote in their report last week, quote, "The single largest foreign holder of our debt is China, a nation that may not share our country's aspirations and strategic interests." Former Bush Secretary Hank Paulson claims that Russia, in 2008, tried to team up with China to sell off big chunks of their holdings in Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the U.S. government-backed mortgage financiers. Russia denies it, but Paulson says the motive was to try and force a U.S. government bailout. After the U.S. revealed this February a new round of arms sales to Taiwan, Chinese Major General Liu Yan told a Chinese government-run magazine, quote, "We could sanction the U.S. using economic means, such as dumping some U.S. government bonds." The new House Majority Leader admits that extending the Bush tax cuts will force America to borrow more money.
If you have less revenues coming into the federal government and more expenditures, what does that add up to? Certainly, you're going to dig the hole deeper.
The U.S. is already in the hole $883 billion just to China, more than double what it held in U.S. treasuries just 3 years ago. Already, American taxpayers pay China $50 billion in interest every year right now. But if foreign powers buy U.S. debt for the next 10 years in the same proportion they hold it now, another 10 years of the Bush tax cuts will put us in the hole to Russia by another $60 billion. And to China by another $420 billion. Nearly $500 billion of new Chinese debt, plus interest. And that's just based on the borrowing we know about. In March, economist Simon Johnson spoke to the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission about a $170 billion increase in the U.K.'s holdings of U.S. treasuries. A great deal of that increase, he said, quote, may be due to China placing offshore dollars in London-based banks. At the time, the UK held a total of $279 billion in U.S. debt. In the 6 months since then, that has increased by another $180 billion, making the UK and its unknown customers the third largest holder of U.S. debt. Caribbean banking centers and their unknown customers come in at number 6, with $145 billion in U.S. Treasury securities. But what about countries less friendly to the U.S.? The U.S. Treasury website lists oil-exporting countries as the 4th largest holder of U.S. debt, with $230 billion in U.S. treasuries. This summer, Secretary Tim Geithner traveled to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, selling them more U.S. debt. How did he do? He won't tell us. In fact, the Treasury Department won't reveal how much individual oil-exporting countries hold, or have ever held in U.S. treasuries. In 1974, Treasury Secretary William Simon struck a deal with Saudi Arabia for the Saudis to start buying billions of dollars of U.S. debt. Secretly. A secret Treasury memo to then Secretary of State Henry Kissinger explained that, quote, purchases under this agreement over the next 6 months are expected to be approximately $2.5 billion. The sine qua non for the Saudis in this arrangement is confidentiality, and we have assured them that we will do everything in our power to comply with their desires. And so they have. From the Carter administration through today, other OPEC countries also buying U.S. debt in secret. Treasury refusing to break out dollar figures for countries such as the United Arab Emirates, Libya, and Iran. Iran? Treasury forms for those buying U.S. Treasuries include a country code for Iran, 42307. The list of major foreign official institutions includes the Central Bank of the Islamic Republic of Iran and other Iranian entities. How much debt they hold and will hold if the Bush tax cuts continue, only Washington and Tehran know for sure. Today we asked the White House and congressional leaders in both parties specifically these two questions. A, how much are they willing to borrow from each of these countries to finance extension of the Bush tax cuts? And B, whether they will reveal how much U.S. debt is bought by oil-exporting countries to finance extension of the Bush tax cuts. No comment from the Republican Party tonight. Speaker Pelosi, also no comment so far. We have a guest from the White House standing by to join us, and Senate Leader Harry Reid's office replied by email, quote, not sure what to say. Needless to say, your question does not lend itself to quick answers. If the choice is borrowing money from these countries or doing nothing, which is the reality we find ourselves in, and that the economy could tank and millions could lose their jobs if we do nothing, which would you choose? No one has said so far that they will tell the